The subject of my talk is different from the one that I originally suggested. I want to talk about China's path to socialism. I'm going to talk largely about the first 30 years. China is an extraordinary case of combined development. So it's a country which has drawn on the latecomer advantage and its own scientific and cultural capabilities to rise from one of the very poorest countries in the world into its second industrial power. And it's quite conceivable that in the near future, it will become the leading economic power in the world, which of course raises very important questions about the role of socialism and the impact of socialism globally. As if a country that is socialist emerges as the leading economy in the world, it will, in many ways, quite radically transform the ways in which we think about socialism. The slide that I'm showing just divides the development of China into the two standard eras, up to the 1980. But I chose 1980 because it was the year of the Volcker shock. And if you compare the developed world, basically Western Europe, EU15, North America, Australia, New Zealand, you find that in that period, those countries grew at about 4% per year, which was quite creditable. But the rest of the world grew at 5.6% per year. So in that period, you can say that the countries that were decolonized actually grew significantly faster than the world average, and they closed global development gaps. China, which started as one of the very poorest, actually grew even faster still through that era, an average of 6.3% per year. And then after 1980, you find that what one might call the global south, or the world excluding the West, actually grew more slowly than the world average. So in that era, Washington consensus, economics and politics, global catch-up effectively came to an end if one removes China. China, conversely, grew at 9.3% per year on average, over a long period of time, helping explain this extraordinary transformation. Well, if you look at China's development, the chart on the right simply plots its growth rate, you find that there were extraordinary fluctuations, but it was an extraordinarily tumultuous process, especially in the first 30 years. And what I'm going to argue is that these fluctuations are fluctuations to which we must pay attention. They're fluctuations that reflect, in part, China's relationship with the rest of the world and the way in which China's relationship with the rest of the world has changed. But they also reflect what I would argue was basically an attempt at the very beginning to identify a path to socialism that still informs China's choices. But that along the way, each step generated different types of contradiction. And at each stage, China had to find solutions to these contradictions in order to try to move forward. Now, I think it's important to recognize that as a developing country, one of the most fundamental problems that China faced was the problem of capital, generating capital to invest. Most of the developed Western countries acquired capital through colonization. But countries such as China and other developing countries can only generate capital through the use of their own resources to a large extent. So in China, throughout most of that first 30 years, investment largely depended upon central government investment expenditure. And the central government essentially spent money to finance its own activities, to finance local government, to finance centrally financed investment projects. The first step that China took was basically land reform in the first few years. So it allocated 700 million mu of arable land to 100 million farming households, more than 300 million farmers, living in more than 100 million natural villages. From that point in time, the rural population essentially fed and housed itself. and surplus food fed the rest of the population. So in the countryside, investment occurred, but largely it was organized by communes in the first 30 years, using labor in slack seasons. Government revenue depended on the value of agricultural output. And it also was the case that the government could acquire an agricultural surplus basically through quota over quota and market sales. And there was a price scissors, which effectively worked against agriculture and enabled them to effectively reduce urban wages, and in that way generate relatively large surpluses from industrial and service activities in urban areas. The agricultural tax provided about 10% of government revenue, and the rest came from taxes on industrial, commercial, and service, very soon, state-owned enterprises, and it came also from their profits. So capital investment fundamentally depended on government revenue. But in the early 1950s and 1970s, the government also obtained foreign loans. So actually, China opened up twice. In the 1950s, it basically opened up by acquiring loans from the Soviet Union. And these loans were used to fund a whole series of projects. And these projects were primarily oriented towards military and heavy industries, largely because of the impact of the Korean War. I mean, China effectively had no choice but to enter that war, since it was quite clear that the United States and its partners planned to drive to the Chinese border and possibly beyond the Chinese border. So the Chinese actually had to enter that war. As a consequence, of course, that led to an even more intense level of embargo against China. Throughout this period, you know, China was embargoed by the United States. So it couldn't acquire medical supplies, it couldn't acquire tractors internationally. So making it even more dependent upon its own resources and placing considerable importance on this relationship initially with the Soviet Union. Now, if you look at the lower chart, well, I'll move to it. The top chart here now, there's a purple line. That purple line plots government deficits. And you can see there were two huge surges. One occurred in the late 1950s, and the second occurred in the late 1970s. In the 1950s, I said already, China, in a sense, opened up to the Soviet Union. But at the end of the 1950s, the relationship with the Soviet Union had started to deteriorate. Initially, you know, Zhou Enlai explained to Nixon, you know, in 1972 that it started to deteriorate in 1955. And the first reason for the deterioration was Khrushchev's condemnation of Stalin. But when they started to develop the second plan, the Soviet Union would provide no further loans. It actually required the repayment of existing loans. And that put China in a very, very difficult situation. So what happened in that case was that basically they had to rely upon local mobilization and on decentralization. So you can see that in that period, there was a very, very large increase in the share of local government expenditure. And exactly the same thing happened after reform and opening up. You see a very, very significant increase in the share of local government expenditure, because again, China moved in the path of decentralization. It moved in the path of decentralization on this occasion because in the 1970s, I mean, Mao actually is said to have received a report from four generals who, contrary to the dominant view in the PLA, thought that China could anticipate 20 years of peace. And it was that document that led to the decision to invite Nixon, and that led to stabilization of relationships with the United States. And immediately, in 1973, in the 4-3 scheme, China acquired 4.3 billion in foreign loans to acquire complete sets of equipment from Western companies to develop export industries along the coast. These export industries designed to enable China to repay loans. In this case, in the second case, this opening up was in a sense sustained, but it too generated serious problems of repayment. And I think you can interpret, many of the reforms in the era of reform and opening up, especially the early reforms, as in a sense, an attempt by the central government to disengage. You can see that in a sense in agriculture, right, with the establishment of the household responsibility system. You can see it Also with the reform of local government finance, the establishment of Fun, so moving away from a common pot to eating from separate stoves. So what I've argued then is, in a sense, China in the 1950s opened up, but then faced a serious financial problem, which led it to move in the direction of relying on local initiative. And then again, in the 1970s, from the early 1970s, it started to open up, but it faced basically a capital problem. And in the face of that capital problem, it actually chose to decentralize. I think, there are other striking features of this chart showing what happened to the fiscal deficit that one can talk about, because I've already mentioned that in the early, late 1950s, early 1960s, there was very quickly a reversal. Now, actually, many of the sorts of reforms that were introduced at the time of reform and opening up started to be introduced in the early 1960s. But, in the early 1960s, the proposals for the new 5-year plan were initially linked to this idea of the four modernizations. The four modernizations came from the 1950s. It then, in a sense, became official policy in the early 1960s. And then in the 1970s and 1980s, again, it, in a sense, drove China's opening up. But that had to be set aside. And it was set aside basically because China had to embark on a third front strategy. At that time, relationships with the Soviet Union had deteriorated. The United States had started to bomb North Vietnam. China had been involved in border conflicts with India. So China decided to move something like much of its core strategic industries to remote mountain areas in the center and west of the country, distant from the borders, where they might be threatened either by the Soviet Union or by the United States. And through that period, China had to commit something like 50% of its capital investment resources to moving these industries to these places where they incurred, on the one hand, huge costs and generated very, very low rates of return. So you could see in this case, how this external context, led to a change of course. And that change of course itself also led, by the late 1960s to new problems of financing investment. You can fit, what happened in the Cultural Revolution also into this story. So, the Cultural Revolution, in a sense, is said to have started in 1966, and the official story is that it didn't end until 1976. In fact, the violent phase in which very many very wrong things happened, that phase was actually relatively short-lived. It started in the army before 1966, where there was a flattening of hierarchies. But, China, in the 1960s, was trying to establish an independent pathway. And in that period, you had the Angang Constitution, right, in the steel sector, which established these close relationships between cadres, workers, technicians, establishing the kind of social relations in the factory, that were then taken up in Japan, right, in the 1980s. China also had problems acquiring oil. So in that case, it basically managed to discover this Daqing oil field and just spoke in that era of the Daqing spirit, because they couldn't acquire oil from the United States, they couldn't acquire oil from the Soviet Union, so they had to develop oil themselves without the technical resources that are normally needed. So it was done through a massive mobilization of labor, people working in Northeast China in very, very difficult conditions for long hours, simply in order to solve fundamental national problem.
Pardon me, Mick, I'm just letting you know you have 2 minutes left. So
right. If you then look at agriculture, right, in the agricultural sector similarly, there was this emphasis upon self-reliance, so-called self-reliance, Dajai, self-reliance program, where people terrace these mountainsides, to grow sufficient food. So, the question at that time was, how do you address the problem of values, attitudes, modes of conduct in the bureaucracy and in education? And in a sense, it was that drove the Cultural Revolution, which led, as you all know, to a whole series of serious excesses. But what's striking is that if you look at the period from 1966, two troughs, to 1976, those two troughs, between those two troughs, China grew at 7.8% per year. So it's difficult to say that that period was universally, a deeply problematic period. And as I've already emphasized, the starting to acquire loans from Western countries dates really from the early 1970s. Another feature of that era, of course, is the fact that China had very high demographic growth. As people like Wen Tiejun have pointed out, China dealt with the problems of finding employment for urban people by sending young people on 3 occasions to the countryside, in 1960 and 1967, and again in 1974. So basically, I said there's a whole series of very complex evolutions. These complex evolutions were not due fundamentally to conflicting views in the leadership, and nor in 1979 was there a simple transition from a plan to a socialist market economy. China, at the outset, had embarked on a process of modernization and transition to socialism. But on that path, it encountered a changing international environment, and it encountered a whole series of problems and difficulties that were generated by the reforms and the reform paths on which it adopted. So I think that means that one has to look, in a slightly different way at the ways in which we actually periodize China's development. And basically, I think I can leave what I wanted to say at that. I was going to finish simply by saying that one of the consequences, however, of this early establishment of a large state presence in the sector is what Chung Yen-Fu talked about at the end, namely the significant importance today of public resources and public assets in shaping the Chinese economy, because this chart simply plots the shares of investment of state-owned and controlled enterprises and private enterprises, and you can see that the state sector accounts for nearly 40% of investment just in recent years. So that's all I wanted to say. I think we have to look at a lot of the changes that happen in these periods, as well as this rather sharp division that's usually drawn between a period up to 1980 and a period after 1980.